So if you were to, design the perfect economy from scratch, you'd probably ask for a massive industrial
Oh,
base.
absolutely. You'd want a multi-trillion-dollar gross domestic product.
Right, like deeply entrenched global supply chains, towering financial districts, basically limitless capital.
Yeah,
It-
because that is the standard blueprint for human development that we've all been taught to accept, right?
Exactly. But what if the data actually proves that the functional blueprint for human well-being doesn't require any of that?
Which is a pretty wild thought.
It really is. So today we are doing a deep dive into an incredibly dense 33-year stack of human development data.
Spanning right from 1990 all the way to 2023.
Right, and the numbers in this report are basically forcing us to look at a tiny, highly vulnerable archipelago in the South Pacific Fiji.
Because, frankly, Fiji is actively embarrassing some of the wealthiest nations on Earth.
They really are, especially when it comes to keeping its people alive, educated, and fundamentally equal.
Yeah, it's a profound structural paradox.
Mm.
And it completely challenges the core macroeconomic assumptions that have governed global policy for, well, the last half-century.
We are heavily conditioned to just assume that a massive economic output, like a huge GDP, automatically translates into human well-being.
Right, but when you look at the longitudinal data from 1990 to 2023, that correlation actually fractures,
It totally breaks apart. High income does not unconditionally equal high development.
especially when you introduce the metric of equality into the mix.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because what we see in Fiji is a society that acts as a real-world stress test for an alternative model.
Yeah, they demonstrate this astonishing resilience in maintaining gender equity and minimizing the wealth disparity that, routinely hollows out the social progress of much richer nations.
Far more industrialized nations, yeah. Which perfectly frames our mission for this deep dive.
Right. We need to tear into this human development report to understand the actual mechanics of progress.
We have to strip away our preconceived notions about stock market indices for a minute and focus on the lived statistical reality of the human experience.
Because we have to ask, how does a nation with a fractional economic footprint build such a resilient society?
And more importantly for you, the listener, what are the structural trade-offs they are forced to make?
Exactly. Because before we can truly analyze Fiji's unique successes, we have to establish the global baseline.
Right, we need to understand what the rest of the world is doing.
And we need to look squarely at the areas where Fiji is actually starting at a severe, measurable disadvantage.
You can't understand the anomaly without first dissecting the average.
Right. So if we look at the global upward climb over the last 30-plus years, humanity as a whole has actually managed a remarkably consistent upward trajectory.
Which we quantify using the Human Development Index, or the HDI.
Exactly. And for context, the HDI is a composite statistic. It doesn't just look at money.
Right, it synthesizes life expectancy, education levels, and per capita income indicators into a single score between 0 and 1.
And back in 1990, the global HDI score was sitting right at 0.60.
But by the time we reached 2023, humanity had steadily climbed to a score of 0.756.
Which officially puts the global average into the high development bracket.
Honestly, from a purely historical perspective, that is a monumental triumph for our species.
It really is. It indicates that across the aggregate of billions of people, we are living longer.
We're spending more years in the classroom, generating more income than we were at the end of the Cold War.
Yeah, but we also know that an aggregate number often smooths out the turbulence of reality.
Oh, for sure. This progress was not an unbroken, frictionless upward curve.
No, it certainly wasn't. And the data from this specific report highlights a very severe global stumble.
Right. When you track the trend line year by year, there is a distinct historical reversal.
Between the years 2020 and 2021, the global HDI took a visible, measurable dip.
And we obviously know the catalyst for this, the compounding global shocks of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right, but the mechanism of the decline is what really matters here. It wasn't just a financial recession.
It was a simultaneous planetary degradation of all three HDI pillars.
Exactly. Mortality rates spiked, slashing life expectancies,
Schools physically closed, completely halting educational progression.
and supply chains froze, cratering incomes. It was a stark statistical reminder that human progress is actually incredibly fragile
And this is exactly where we need to bring Fiji into the analytical frame.
because their parallel path through this timeline is deeply revealing about the mechanics of vulnerability.
Fiji's current HDI for 2023 sits at 0.731. That places them 116th globally.
So they are hovering just slightly below the global average.
Right, though they're still firmly categorized within that high development bracket.
Yeah, and if you look at their trajectory from 1990, it largely mimics the global upward trend.
They were building their society basically in step with the rest of the world.
However, when that 2020 to 2021 macroeconomic and biological shock hit,
Fiji suffered a notably sharper drop than the global average.
right, their HDI fell from 0.710 down to 0.705 in just a single year.
Which is a perfect illustration of the inherent fragility of small island developing states.
The mechanics of their economy dictate a really high degree of exposure to external volatility.
Yeah, when you are an archipelago nation, you just do not have a massive internal domestic market to fall back on when global trade seizes up.
Exactly. You don't have a highly diversified industrial base. You rely heavily on international tourism.
Which went to absolute zero.
Right. And you rely on complex, long-distance maritime supply chains for basic goods.
Which broke down completely.
So the macroeconomic baseline of the society takes a much heavier, more immediate hit than a massive continental economy that has, built-in redundancies.
So they are fundamentally vulnerable to the outside world.
They are.
But as we dig deeper into the data, it reveals an even harsher reality.
Yeah, an internal vulnerability that shapes the very foundation of their society.
And that is the dimension of life expectancy, the literal biological length of life.
Right.
Because the global average life expectancy in this 2023 data is 73.4 years.
But in Fiji, the average life expectancy is significantly lower, sitting at just 67.3 years.
We are looking at a painful, glaring scissor gap of 6.1 years.
It's a massive foundational deficit.
Yeah.
When you are evaluating the mechanics of human development, time is the ultimate non-renewable currency.
Losing over 6 years of life expectancy compared to the global average creates these cascading systemic frictions across everything else in that society.
Think about the economic implications alone. You have 6 fewer years of peak earning potential.
6 fewer years of compounding investments or savings.
Right, and a truncated period for the transfer of intergenerational knowledge within families and industries.
To put it in perspective for the listener, if human development is a marathon, Fiji is essentially running the race wearing a weighted vest.
That's a great analogy.
If the average citizen has 6 fewer years to build wealth, to advance in a specialized career, or to simply exist as a productive member of the community,
The mathematical expectation would be that their overall HDI score should be plummeting toward the bottom of the index.
exactly. Yet they are maintaining an HDI of 0.731, holding incredibly close to the global average of 0.756.
So how do you overcome a 6-year handicap in the fundamental duration of life and still remain highly developed?
That is the central question of the Fiji model.
But before we answer how they overcome it, we really have to look at the internal anatomy of that mortality rate.
Because that 67.3-year average hides a severe, highly specific gender disparity.
Yeah, according to the data, Fijian men have a life expectancy of just 65.3 years.
Wow.
Compare that to 69.4 years for Fijian women.
That is a severe internal divergence, a 4-year gap between men and women living on the exact same islands.
Operating within the exact same macroeconomic environment.
Precisely. Now, it is a well-documented global trend that women generally outlive men due to biological and behavioral factors.
Right. But a gap that suppresses male life expectancy down to the mid-60s is a glaring systemic alarm bell.
It signals an urgent, critical need for targeted male health interventions.
Yeah, when we analyze the mechanisms behind this kind of localized mortality drop, we're usually looking at a combination of occupational hazards, dramatic shifts in dietary habits.
Like the influx of highly processed imported foods common in Pacific Island nations.
Exactly, which leads to spikes in non-communicable diseases like diabetes and cardiovascular issues.
And delayed medical intervention. The men in Fiji are dying far too young, and that biological reality acts as a massive anchor dragging down their aggregate development score.
So we have thoroughly established the baseline and the burden.
We're looking at a nation with a lower overall life expectancy, a severe structural vulnerability to global economic shocks, and a highly specific crisis in male mortality.
By all conventional macroeconomic logic, a nation facing these foundational hurdles should not be competitive on the global human development scale.
They should be languishing, but they aren't.
No, they really aren't.
So we have to look at the mechanism of their resilience. If their life expectancy is the weighted vest, what is the engine pulling them forward?
To offset that deficit in the literal length of life, Fiji has engineered a radical pivot toward a completely different pillar of human development.
Which is knowledge.
Exactly. The overarching strategy revealed in the data is one of intense, concentrated educational investment.
If the population has less time on Earth, the societal structure has been designed to ensure that the time they do have is highly educated.
Highly capable and highly adaptable.
We are moving our focus from the hospital ward to the classroom.
And this is where the data shifts from sobering to genuinely remarkable.
Let's examine the global metric for the mean years of schooling.
This metric calculates the average number of years of education received by people ages 25 and older.
Right. The global average currently sits at 8.8 years.
But Fiji's average sits at 10.4 years.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because when you scale that difference across an entire national population, it represents a staggering structural advantage.
They're maintaining a 1.6-year lead over the global average.
Let's break down why that 1.6 years is so critical. If we just think about an individual, an extra year and a half of school might just seem like finishing an associate's degree.
Or completing a vocational program.
Right. But when you aggregate that 1.6-year advantage across hundreds of thousands of people, it fundamentally alters the bedrock of the society.
It means the vast majority of their population isn't just acquiring basic literacy and numeracy and then dropping out to enter low-skill labor.
They are completing secondary education. They are moving into advanced technical training.
They're literally outlearning the global average.
And that educational density completely rewires the economic capability of a workforce.
A national labor pool with 10.4 years of schooling is fundamentally more adaptable than one with 8.8 years.
They are more capable of handling complex, abstract tasks, quicker to adopt new technologies.
And far more resilient to sudden shifts in the global economy.
Yeah, if a primary industry collapses, a highly educated workforce can be retrained.
Right, whereas an uneducated workforce simply becomes unemployed.
But the true brilliance of Fiji's educational framework isn't just the high average number.
No, it is the sheer equity of how that education is distributed across the population.
Which brings us directly to the Gender Development Index, or the GDI.
To fully appreciate what Fiji has achieved here, we have to contextualize it against the broader global gender disparities.
And the global data here presents a deeply frustrating contradiction.
It really does. Because globally, women actually have a slight fractional edge over men in expected years of schooling.
The data shows 13.1 expected years for women versus 13.0 for men.
So on a purely superficial level, that looks like a victory for global institutional equality.
The access to the classroom appears balanced.
It does, until you look at the mechanism of economic translation.
Yeah, despite achieving parity and even a slight advantage in global expected schooling, the global gross national income, or GNI, for women is staggeringly suppressed.
The data shows women globally earning an average of $14,943.
And men globally, they earn $25,751.
That is a massive systemic chasm.
Over $10,000.
Yeah, and it highlights a painful reality of the global economic architecture. Women are putting in the time, they are acquiring the necessary education and skills.
But they are absolutely not realizing the economic return on that investment.
Exactly. The global economy fundamentally discounts female labor, routinely trapping highly educated women in lower-paying sectors.
Or worse, relying entirely on their uncompensated care work to subsidize the broader economy.
Right. So keep that grim global reality in mind as we zoom in on Fiji's GDI score.
Right. The Gender Development Index measures gender gaps in human development achievements by strictly accounting for disparities between women and men.
Looking at health, knowledge, and living standards.
And a perfect score of 1.0 represents absolute, flawless equality.
For 2023, Fiji boasts a GDI score of 0.948.
Statistically speaking, that score establishes Fiji as a global paradigm of equity.
It is a brilliant systemic achievement that requires massive intentionality from a policy perspective.
And when you unpack the specific schooling numbers driving that 0.948 score, the intentionality becomes really obvious.
We just discussed how the global expected schooling is essentially tied at roughly 13 years.
But in Fiji, women have an expected 14.4 years of schooling.
That doesn't just match the men in Fiji. It significantly outstrips them.
Because Fijian men sit at an expected 13.3 years.
The women in this island nation are surpassing the men in the classroom by over a full year.
So why does this specific disparity matter so much?
Let's analyze the mechanics of why this is so crucial for a developing nation's long-term viability. Education is a completely irrevocable asset.
You can experience a catastrophic currency devaluation.
Your primary agricultural exports can be wiped out by a Category 5 cyclone.
Your entire global tourism sector can dry up overnight due to a pandemic.
Exactly. But you cannot confiscate a population's education. It is permanent, internalized infrastructure.
It is intellectual capital that survives external shocks.
Precisely. And when you cultivate a highly educated female populace, you completely alter the generational trajectory of the nation's development.
The sociological data on this is absolute. Highly educated mothers tend to have significantly healthier children.
They invest more aggressively in their children's cognitive development and early education.
Furthermore, they are far more capable of navigating complex healthcare systems, advocating for their family's medical needs, and understanding preventative care.
By heavily subsidizing and encouraging female education to the tune of 14.4 years, Fiji has effectively purchased a profound societal insurance policy against extreme volatility.
Even if the nation struggles to generate a massive GDP, the foundational resilience provided by that educated female demographic stabilizes the entire social structure from the ground up.
So we have this incredible soft power, this educational insurance policy.
The next logical analytical step is to examine how that knowledge translates into physical safety and systemic equality.
We need to move out of the theoretical realm of the classroom and look at the harsh realities of the delivery room and the broader societal structure.
Because all the knowledge in the world means nothing if the biological survival of the population is fundamentally compromised.
This brings us to a distinct and critical metric known as the Gender Inequality Index, or the GII.
It is vital to understand how this differs from the HDI or the GDI.
Right. Those indices measure achievements. The GII measures the loss in potential human development due to systemic inequality between female and male achievements.
It strictly evaluates reproductive health, societal empowerment, and the labor market.
It's an index designed to highlight the specific, life-threatening danger zones for women within a society.
And when we look at the global baseline for the GII, the numbers are nothing short of a systemic tragedy.
The Global Gender Inequality Index sits at 0.455.
And remember, because this measures inequality and loss, a lower number is better.
When you dissect that 0.455, the underlying health data is really grim.
We are looking at a global maternal mortality rate of 216 deaths per 100,000 live births.
Over 200 women dying for every 100,000 babies born. It is a devastating metric of systemic failure.
Alongside that, we see a global adolescent birth rate of 39.1 births per 1,000 women ages 15 to 19.
When you look at maternal mortality, it's easy to just see a spreadsheet.
But if you're trying to build a resilient economy, every maternal death is a systemic collapse of a family unit.
And every adolescent birth is a young woman whose educational and economic trajectory has been drastically and often permanently altered.
These are not merely health statistics. They are immense barriers to the realization of human potential.
They represent a massive, compounding loss of human capital before it ever has a chance to fully mature.
When a teenager has a child, her expected 13 or 14 years of schooling is almost universally severed.
The economic and intellectual potential she would have brought to the society is lost, replaced by immediate, uncompensated care demands.
Which is exactly why Fiji's performance in healthcare equity demands our attention.
Let's look at their GII. The global average is 0.455. Fiji's GII is a remarkably low 0.350.
They are vastly structurally outperforming the global average.
And the standout statistic that anchors this achievement, Fiji's maternal mortality rate is only 38 per 100,000 live births.
A drop from the global 216 down to 38.
That is an exponential difference in the basic biological survival of their citizens.
And their adolescent birth rates mirror this success, sitting at roughly 21.1 per 1,000 compared to the global 39.1.
We really need to pause and analyze the mechanism here. How does a small island nation achieve this?
Right. So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We are constantly sold this macroeconomic narrative that you need a booming, massive GDP to afford functional healthcare.
The assumption is that wealth equals health.
That you need advanced, capital-intensive hospital systems, surgical robotics, and endless pharmaceutical funding to keep people alive.
It is the assumption that high-quality healthcare is a luxury good available only to heavily industrialized economies.
Precisely. But the data out of Fiji proves that narrative is fundamentally flawed.
You do not need a multi-trillion-dollar GDP to prevent mothers from dying in childbirth.
What you need is targeted, equitable healthcare distribution.
You need decentralized infrastructure, In an archipelago, you can't rely on one massive hospital in a capital city.
You need a robust network of trained midwives, highly accessible rural and island clinics, and a deeply ingrained societal commitment to reproductive health.
Fiji proves that protecting vulnerable populations is a matter of policy execution and resource allocation, not just sheer overwhelming wealth.
They have clearly made a systemic decision that mothers will not die in childbirth, and they have built the precise, targeted infrastructure to ensure it, utilizing a fraction of the budget of Western nations.
And if we analyze the causality here, it connects beautifully back to the educational data we just unpacked.
How do you drive a maternal mortality rate down to 38 per 100,000 in a resource-constrained environment?
You educate the women.
Exactly.
When the female population possesses an expected 14.4 years of schooling, you have a population with high health literacy.
They understand the critical importance of early prenatal care.
They can recognize the biological warning signs during pregnancy.
They have the vocabulary and the confidence to advocate for themselves in a clinical setting.
Furthermore, highly educated women are statistically far more likely to delay childbirth until they are biologically, emotionally, and financially prepared.
Which perfectly explains the dramatic reduction in the adolescent birth rate. The educational pillar is acting as the primary load-bearing support for the healthcare pillar.
It is a beautifully interconnected, self-reinforcing system.
We've spent the first half of this deep dive breaking down how Fiji operates as an incredible model of education and healthcare equity.
They are outlearning the global average, they are keeping their mothers safe through targeted infrastructure, and their women are thriving intellectually.
But if we are going to look at the whole picture, we have to look at the failure points.
Yeah, the data reveals a very stark, incredibly stubborn contradiction that prevents Fiji from reaching absolute economic equality.
We have to confront the persistent wall of their labor force realities.
This is where the narrative shifts from an unmitigated success story to a highly complex structural challenge.
It exposes the absolute limits of education as a standalone silver bullet.
If we examine the global labor force participation numbers, we see a familiar systemic gap. Globally, women participate in the formal labor force at a rate of 48.5%.
While men participate at 74.1%.
So on a planetary scale, less than half of all women are engaged in the formal workforce, compared to roughly 3/4 of men.
Okay, now, given the extensive framework we have just built regarding Fiji, they're highly educated women with 14.4 expected years of schooling, their excellent reproductive health, their low adolescent birth rates.
The logical economic expectation would be that their female labor force participation should be sky high.
It should easily eclipse that 48.5% global average.
But it absolutely does not.
In Fiji, male labor force participation is 75.8%, tracking almost perfectly with the global average.
But female participation in Fiji, it sits at a dismal 38.4%.
That is significantly lower than the global average.
It represents a nearly 37-point participation gap between men and women operating within the exact same domestic economy.
I am looking at these labor numbers and I am genuinely struggling to reconcile them. I have to push back on the economic logic of this entirely.
Go for it.
If a government is heavily subsidizing and driving female education up to 14.4 years, meaning they're investing massive amounts of time, public infrastructure, and capital into these women,
Right.
it makes absolutely zero fiscal sense for them to let that highly trained talent pool sit outside the formal economy. It's an astronomical waste of human capital.
It is.
Are they deliberately incentivizing unpaid care work, or is this just a massive unresolved market failure? Where is that educated labor going?
It is the most glaring critical paradox in the entire data set, and your pushback highlights the exact friction point of their development model.
Why is there a 37-point gap in the workforce? Are these degrees just sitting on a shelf?
What this massive divergence reveals is the incredibly sticky, resilient nature of structural and cultural barriers.
Ah.
The data is explicitly telling us that achieving high education and stellar health outcomes does not automatically dismantle traditional gender roles within an economy.
It's like spending a decade engineering a high-speed, state-of-the-art bullet train, but completely forgetting to lay down the tracks.
Yes.
The potential energy is massive, the vehicle is perfectly built, but it has literally nowhere to go to generate momentum.
That is the perfect mechanical analogy. You can cultivate the most highly educated, biologically healthy female population on the planet. But if the underlying societal structure still strictly demands that women absorb 100% of the unpaid care economy.
Raising children, caring for elderly relatives, managing the logistical burden of the household.
Exactly. If they are doing all of that, they simply do not have the temporal bandwidth to participate in the formal labor market.
Furthermore, this points directly to a severe lack of formal childcare infrastructure.
Right. If a society does not provide accessible, affordable childcare, the brutal economic math of a household dictates that one parent must stay home.
And deeply entrenched cultural norms almost always dictate that the parent staying home is the woman, entirely regardless of her 14.4 years of advanced schooling.
And think about the sheer volume of lost GDP.
Imagine the economic explosion Fiji would experience if they could figure out how to integrate that highly educated 38.4% up to the 75% participation level of the men.
It proves that human development is a multi-front war.
You can be completely victorious on the health front and the education front, but if you lose on the structural macroeconomic front,
If the workplace isn't flexible, if paternity leave isn't structurally normalized, if childcare is prohibitively expensive,
that education never translates into actual economic power. Fiji has conquered the classroom, but they're hitting a reinforced brick wall at the office door.
it is a profound systemic friction. And it perfectly transitions into our next analytical phase.
Because having identified this massive disconnect between educational capacity and actual income generation, we are forced to ask a much broader, deeply uncomfortable question about global wealth itself.
Right. When we look at the global averages for human development and income, how much of that development is actually a statistical mirage?
How much of the global progress we celebrate is just an illusion generated by the hyper-concentration of wealth at the very top?
Which brings us to what I call the dehydrated truth of development.
We need to examine the IHDI, the Inequality-Adjusted Human Development Index.
To understand the mechanics of this metric, think about evaluating a corporation's financial health.
Looking at the standard HDI is like looking purely at a company's gross revenue. It's a big, impressive number, and it makes the company look massive.
But the IHDI is like the forensic accountant stepping in and calculating the actual operating profit after factoring in the massive debt load.
The IHDI recalculates human development by aggressively discounting the progress and wealth that is hoarded by a tiny percentage of the population at the top.
It strips away the liabilities of inequality.
It essentially squeezes the statistical water out of the data to reveal the actual lived reality of the median human being.
And the global illusion that the IHDI reveals is absolutely staggering.
Globally, when you mathematically adjust for inequality, human development loses a massive 21.96% of its total value.
That means over a fifth of all human progress on this planet is essentially an illusion generated by unequal distribution.
And if you isolate and look specifically at the income dimension, income inequality alone wipes out 30.3% of global progress.
A 30% loss. That means almost a third of the world's wealth is mathematically irrelevant to the daily development and survival of the average human being.
It's the ultra-wealthy, the billionaires and massive conglomerates skewing the global average so high that it completely obfuscates the fact that millions upon millions of people are economically stagnating.
The gross revenue is high, but the operating profit for humanity is terrible.
But then we apply this exact same forensic accounting to Fiji.
Right. And by contrast, Fiji's IHDI loss rate is only 14.4%.
What's fascinating here is the mechanics of their societal structure.
Yes, objectively, Fiji has a much smaller total gross domestic product than a Western superpower.
But that wealth, those targeted health benefits we discussed, those expansive educational opportunities, they are distributed much more evenly across the population.
Like peanut butter spread evenly on a slice of bread rather than a giant lump in the middle.
Exactly. They have systemic mechanisms, whether it's the communal land ownership structures, strong kinship networks, or targeted social safety nets that prevent wealth from hyper-concentrating at the top.
So while a larger economy might have a massive gross revenue, their inequality debt load is crushing the average citizen.
Fiji operates with lower revenue, but a vastly superior profit margin for its people.
Exactly. And a society operating with a 14.4% inequality loss is fundamentally structurally more stable than a society operating with a 22% loss.
It indicates a more robust middle class, less extreme poverty dragging down the bottom, and significantly less social friction.
It is a highly resilient economic structure designed for stability rather than exponential top-heavy growth.
But a true deep dive means we can't just admire the stability of the middle. We have to rigorously scan the bottom.
We have to look at the people who are still falling through the cracks, even in a highly equitable society like Fiji.
To achieve this, the report uses the Multi-Dimensional Poverty Index, or the MPI.
This is a crucial metric because it doesn't just look at an arbitrary financial threshold like living on less than $2 a day.
It looks at the actual mechanics of poverty, the overlapping deprivations in daily health, basic education, and immediate living standards.
And Fiji's performance on the MPI is nothing short of remarkable. Their multidimensional poverty rate is mathematically logged at essentially zero, specifically 0.0006.
Extreme overlapping poverty has been virtually eradicated from the society.
But, and this is why understanding the mechanics of data is so vital, when you zoom in with a microscope on that tiny fraction of a percentage point, that 0.006, the data reveals a laser-specific structural vulnerability.
Of the very tiny amount of poverty that still exists in Fiji, 30% of it is driven entirely by nutrition issues, and 12.1% is driven by school attendance issues.
This perfectly demonstrates the administrative power of granular data. If you are a macroeconomic policymaker in Fiji, this specific MPI breakdown tells you exactly how to allocate your limited capital.
You do not need to launch massive, sweeping, multi-billion-dollar poverty eradication campaigns.
You do not need to attempt to rebuild the entire macroeconomic engine. You need high-precision intervention.
It's the difference between using a targeted surgical laser versus swinging a broadsword in the dark.
Precisely. The data explicitly tells you that 30% of your remaining poverty friction is nutritional.
So the mechanism of policy is clear. You implement highly targeted nutritional logistics.
Perhaps that means funding free, heavily fortified meals, specifically in remote rural or island schools.
Or creating direct agricultural subsidies for nutrient-dense crops aimed at vulnerable family units, combating that influx of processed foods we mentioned earlier.
Furthermore, you know that 12.1% of the poverty is linked to school attendance.
So you investigate the specific mechanical friction keeping those children out of the classroom.
Is it a lack of reliable maritime transportation between islands? Is it an acute economic need for them to work on a family farm?
You isolate and target the specific friction point.
This level of data resolution allows a small nation with a highly constrained budget to deploy its capital with absolute maximum efficiency.
It truly is a masterclass in institutional self-awareness. They know exactly where their structural weaknesses are.
So we have thoroughly analyzed how resources are distributed among humans.
We've looked at the mechanics of their education, the logistical triumph of their maternal health, the persistent friction of their labor force, and the surgical precision of their poverty reduction.
But there is one final massive overriding piece to this macroeconomic puzzle.
Because all of this development, every single hospital, every 14.4 years of schooling, every economic transaction does not exist in a vacuum.
It exists on a physical planet. What is the actual biological cost of these resources to the Earth itself?
Eventually, the ecological bill comes due. And to quantify this, the report utilizes a relatively new, deeply necessary metric, the Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI, or the PHDI.
This index takes the standard human development score and aggressively discounts it based on a nation's per capita carbon dioxide emissions and its total material footprint.
It forces an accounting of the ecological debt incurred to achieve the development.
Let's examine the global numbers through this ecological lens.
Right.
To achieve that global HDI of 0.756, humanity relies almost exclusively on the extraction of materials and the burning of fossil fuels.
Globally, we emit an average of 4.54 tons of CO2 per capita.
Let me repeat the scale of that. 4.54 tons of invisible heat-trapping gas per person per year pumped into the atmosphere simply to keep the global economic engine running.
Because of this massive, unsustainable ecological pressure, when you adjust the global HDI for environmental damage, the score plummets by a full 10%.
Which analytically means that 10% of our entire global human development is essentially a predatory loan, borrowed directly against the future viability of the planet's biosphere.
But then we look at Fiji's green ledger.
Yes, Fiji's carbon emissions are remarkably structurally low. They sit at only 1.22 tons of CO2 per capita.
That is roughly 1/4 of the global average.
It demands a very stark economic analogy.
Think about it this way. The global north, the highly industrialized, wealthy nations, they basically bought their high human development on a high-interest ecological credit card.
They swiped that card to fund centuries of industrial revolutions, the construction of massive interstate highway systems, and an economy built on cheap, dirty energy.
And now the planet's biosphere is calling to collect the massive debt.
But Fiji built its development using the actual sustainable cash it had in its wallet.
They achieved their 0.731 HDI, they engineered their 10.4 mean years of schooling, they drove their maternal mortality down to 38, all while emitting a tiny fraction of the carbon.
They have mathematically proven that high human development does not require the systemic destruction of the biosphere.
And this brings us to the ultimate, profound injustice of this entire macroeconomic analysis.
If we connect this specific ecological data to the broader geographical reality, Fiji operates a highly sustainable, low-carbon, highly equitable development model.
They are doing absolutely everything correctly by the metrics of future survival.
Yet, precisely because they are a low-lying archipelago nation, they are the ones most immediately and existentially threatened by the rising sea levels.
The ocean acidification and the extreme weather events caused entirely by the global 4.54-ton emission average.
The populations that contributed the absolute least to the ecological collapse are mathematically positioned to pay the highest possible price.
The global north swiped the ecological credit card, but the catastrophic bill is being mailed directly to Fiji.
It is a profound structural irony, and it forces a complete reevaluation of the very architecture of how we measure macroeconomic success.
For decades, global institutions praised and rewarded nations that burned the most coal, extracted the most resources, and pumped the most oil simply because their GDP skyrocketed.
We labeled them developed, and we looked at nations like Fiji, which were living largely within their ecological means and investing in human capital rather than sheer industrial output, and condescendingly called them developing.
Which perfectly brings us to our final takeaway for today, what we can definitively call the Fiji blueprint.
We started this deep dive looking at a tiny microeconomy and wondering how it could possibly compete with the multi-trillion-dollar titans.
The answer the data provides is that the Fiji model is small, but it is structurally brilliant.
It proves beyond a shadow of doubt that a nation does not need a dominant, hyper-industrialized global economy to achieve incredible, equitable things for its citizens.
If we were to distill this massive report into the actionable takeaways of that blueprint, it rests on three absolute structural pillars.
Pillar 1. Education as the ultimate driver.
About overeducating their population and specifically targeting women for 14.4 years of schooling, they bought an intellectual insurance policy against poverty, systemic health crises, and economic volatility.
Pillar 2. Fair distribution.
They absolutely do not have the most gross wealth, but by utilizing social mechanisms to minimize their inequality loss to just 14.4%, they ensure that the resources they do have efficiently reach the people who need them.
Creating a highly stable, resilient society. And Pillar 3. Green, sustainable growth.
They engineered this entire equitable society with a carbon footprint that is merely a fraction of the destructive global average.
When we look at these numbers, it forces us to ask how we measure our own progress.
True development isn't just about the raw, unchecked accumulation of wealth in your society, your company, or your own life.
It's about the operating margin of humanity.
It's about ensuring every individual has an equal right and opportunity to develop.
This raises one final crucial question to consider.
If macroeconomic human development indices had rigorously factored in the survival of the environment from the very beginning, rather than it being a recent, polite adjustment,
would we have always considered islands like Fiji to be the truly developed world and the heavily polluting, highly unequal global north to be the ones desperately in need of development?
Consider those two economic engines we discussed at the very beginning, the massive roaring global machine and the tiny island.
Maybe the tiny island isn't struggling to catch up behind us.
If you look closely at the data, maybe they've been waiting at the finish line this entire time. Keep diving deep. We'll see you next time.